Hey, Sun Devils. Welcome to week 21 of this AP European history class. We are on the way to getting to World War I, the biggest and most epic war in the history of the world until World War II. Those two wars are really a part of the same experience. They happened during the 20th century, and we have been and will continue to lay the groundwork leading up to those two catastrophically huge and significant issues that happen in our world. There's a lot of social unrest and things that lead up to the 20th century that kind of pave the path, if you will. One of those concepts that's going to directly lead to World War I is the concept of nationalism. Another one of the principles that's going to lead up to World War I is imperialism. Those are the first two topics that we studied this semester: nationalism during week 19 and imperialism during week 20. We're going to take both of those ideas and really try to show us this time frame of the 19th century. That's the 1800s, and some of the social unrest that's happening around the world. We're going to focus in on the mother of all countries. The mother of all countries, of course, is China. China has the world's biggest population, and that's why it matters. So, what is the population of the world? I'm recording this in January of 2021. And so, if you go and Google this information, you might find slightly different statistic and data depending on which website you use. But the information you find here is going to be very accurate. So, what is the population of the world? I think that's essential for every single student in a history class. In fact, any student in school who's not aware of the people on the planet Earth is going to be ignorant and not going to be able to talk academically. And you're going to have that layer of I don't understand numbers in front of you. So let's start off there. How many people are on the planet Earth? You can go Google it right now, and you're going to find a number over 7 billion, but under 8 billion. So over 7 billion people on the planet Earth when I'm recording this. And that's a gigantic number. In fact, that number is too big to understand. Now you might think, well, it's not that hard, Mr. Moore. I'm looking at it right now. It's not that many zeros. I can say 7 billion super easy. But the problem is it's impossible to count to the number 7 billion. It's impossible for a human being to count that high. If you counted your entire life, I mean, literally, that's all you did. You didn't eat, you didn't sleep, you started counting from the second you were born, and that's not possible. And you counted all the way up, and you lived to be 100, which unfortunately, most of us won't make it that long. You couldn't even count halfway to 7 billion. I don't know if you just heard me, but 7 billion is such a giant number that if you spent your entire life trying to count, you couldn't get there. If that's all you did, you didn't eat or sleep. So 7 billion is an impossibly giant number to comprehend. And out of the 7 billion people that live on the planet Earth, China and India are easily the most populated countries on the planet Earth. And again, if you go and Google this data, you're going to find a number very close to that number: 1,400,000,000 people in China. If you Google what's the population of India, you're going to find a number around 1,300,000,000. That means that China and India have pretty stinking close to half of the world's population just in those two countries alone. The country in third place is the United States, and we're not even close to how big China and India's population are. China has more people than we do, plus 1 billion. And India is going to probably surpass China in the next couple years as far as number of people, because China has purposefully implemented government programs to limit the number of people in their country. They've had a one child policy, and they've kind of softened it over the last few years, and they've, it's evolved over time. But China has instigated a one child policy for multiple years to try to curb their population growth. And India has not. India has just been going gangbusters on population explosion. So within your lifetime, I suspect, and obviously this is just a prediction, but it's an educated prediction that India will surpass China within your lifetime, easily within my lifetime, I'm sure, maybe within the next decade or less. So that's something that's really important to understand. The United States is the third most populated country, and we're not even close to India and China. It's important to look at numbers, but numbers don't mean anything unless you can understand them, unless you can have an emotional connection to the numbers. Oftentimes, we throw out numbers like statistics and data, but if we don't understand what those numbers are telling us, then they become pointless and fruitless. If you look at China, it is clearly not the biggest country on the planet Earth. India is not even close to as big as China, but that's where most people live. So here's where we start to do a little bit of comparison, and it makes us think differently. It helps us to understand the information that's coming into our brains. For instance, the world's biggest country land size is easily Russia. There was, I don't know, 40 or 50 years where Russia kind of went under a different name called the Soviet Union, right? From the 1917 October Revolution all the way through 1991. Do a little bit of math, 80 years or so. I was thinking of the 50 years after World War II, where Soviet Union was at its height, maybe per se. But it went through different transitional and territorial changes even before World War One. Then it became the Soviet Union, Russia did, and it incorporated a lot more land and territory than Russia does today. I could have just simply said the Soviet Union was even bigger than Russia is today. But Russia is clearly the world's biggest country, but it doesn't even have a population even close to even the United States. You can go Google the population of Russia, and you'll be surprised. It's got so much territory, but the population isn't so big. So what does that mean about India versus Russia? You've got a way bigger, you could probably take the population of Russia and double it, and it would still fit within the 300 million mark. That means they have a billion plus double the amount of people in Russia. And so as we look at statistics like that, it kind of affects what life looks like in different countries. Canada is the world's second biggest country. Canada is bigger than the United States territorially, but it's not even close to the population size. In fact, you can go Google this. There are more people that live in California, just the state of California, 1 out of 50 states. Okay, this little slice of the United States, California, has more people than the entire country of Canada, the world's second biggest country. So again, data by itself doesn't tell us anything. But when we take data and we compare it to other things, then we start to get the full picture. And what's the point of all of this? We live in an Asian world. If this pie chart right here was representing all the people on the planet Earth, and we were splitting up population by continent, we live in an Asian world. The red on this pie chart represents the amount of people on the planet Earth that live on the continent of Asia. Okay? Obviously, Europe takes up what? 11% of the slice of the pie. North America, we're shooting around 8%. South America, some 6%. And of course, Africa is a giant continent with a lot of people, bigger than any slice except Asia. Up in the corner, I have another, picture image to try to help us understand. If you drew a circle around this part of Asia, you can clearly see right here, this part of Asia, there are more people living inside that circle than outside that circle. That's to try to help you understand how significant Asia is. Now, in this class, this particular class that you're taking, this is an AP European history class. And so we're looking at the last 500 years of history through European eyes. And as I've tried to tell you from the beginning of this class, one of the reasons that's significant is because over the last 500 years, Europeans have taken over the planet Earth. And I've tried to help you understand that every language in every country of North and South America, they speak a European language. Australia speaks a European language, English, right? New Zealand and Australia, they speak English. In North and South America, it's dominated by Spanish, Portuguese and English, French and Dutch. Those are the five major colonial powers that influenced North and South America. The entire continent of Africa is going to be taken over by Europeans. Some people will say, well, Ethiopia wasn't taken over. And that's true during the scramble for Africa during the late 1800s. But before World War II starts, Italy invades Ethiopia. And so I would say that 100% of Africa is eventually going to be taken over by Europeans, even Ethiopia. Now, the last piece of the puzzle, then, of course, on the planet Earth would be Asia. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Remember, it was Europeans trying to get to Asian markets that sparked the era of exploration. Remember, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He wasn't trying to get to the Americas. He was trying to get access to Asian markets, the goods, commodities, and things that were coming out of China, porcelains and silk and tea, right? All these things are going to become majorly important commodities that are traded throughout the world, and they're coming from Asian markets. So economics drive the world. And because China has such a large population and valuable products, everybody wanted a piece of it. Going back to the beginning of this class, remember that when the Turks overtook Constantinople and destroyed the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome, in the 1450s, trade that had been coming from Asia, like India and China, had been going through Islamic lands. But Europeans wanted to go directly to Asian markets then to get access to these goods and commodities that they wanted. The British wanted tea, along with silk, porcelain to sell in European markets and in colonies around the world. But the problem was the Chinese didn't want anything back from Europeans. The Europeans wanted Asian goods, but quite frankly, the Asians didn't want anything the Europeans had to offer until opium was being introduced. Opium, of course, is a drug. It's used to make heroin, and it also makes some prescription painkillers that people call opioids. They are extremely addictive, and they can cause widespread social problems. So, in essence, the British and other Europeans, Dutch and French and such, but especially the British, got involved in this early drug trade. They found something that the Chinese wanted, and that way they could try to balance the trade with China. The great thing about selling drugs is you always get a return customer. If you're using drugs, you're going to ruin your life. But if you're selling the drugs, the great thing about selling drugs is you have a return customer until they overdose and die. I'm not trying to advocate drug selling, but we can see why it's such a lucrative thing that still exists in the world today. What drives it is economics. And if you take the morals out of it, if you try to take away the right and wrong of it, it's a commodity that's always selling. And because it's addictive, you always get a return customer. That's why it's so dangerous to use. Okay. I'm not advocating it, but I'm trying to show you the irony of it all, right? I'm trying to help you understand that the British were really acting as like a drug cartel, selling opium to Chinese, and then they were able to start trading at a higher level than they were before. The British East India Company, sometimes referred to as the British East India Trading Company, was a business involved in drug trafficking. Kind of like a cartel, it had its own army and navy to a certain extent. Now, the official Royal Navy would often back up merchants, and sometimes troops were deployed in places to make sure that trade, was still working fluidly. But the East India Trading Company also kind of hired its own mercenaries to make sure that trade remained open. And there were Chinese officials who saw the devastation that these drugs were hitting the society with, that tried to stop this opium trade. And the British are going to go in and take care of business. It's going to create a war. And that's where we're heading right now, the opium wars. So Chinese bureaucrats, that's professional government workers. So Chinese bureaucrats wanted to stop the drug sales. So they tried to kick European merchants out of their country. Now, obviously, because there's so much money involved, the British aren't going to just leave. And the last dynasty of imperial China was the Qing dynasty, and it was based out of a part of China that we call Manchuria. If we want to just rewind the clock for a second, I'm just going to rewind so you can see it. If you know where Korea is, North and South Korea, and this country right here is Mongolia, if you draw a line from Mongolia over to Korea, essentially this piece of China that's way far north, further north than the Great Wall of China, it's like a northern territory of China that's specifically referred to as Manchuria. Now, that's kind of a European name for it, but this piece of China is called Manchuria, and the Manchurians were controlling all of China at this time. There's a lot of Chinese dynasties. We're not going to get into all of Chinese dynasties, but a lot of people trace it back to, the Shah, the Zhou, the Shan. We get into Han Dynasty that kind of happens at the same time as the Roman Empire, around the 0 mark on the Christian calendar. The most important dynasty in all of China was the Han. And after the Han, we get the Tang and the Song. And then after the Mongol invasions in the Middle Ages, we get the Ming and the Qing. And the Qing dynasty is the last imperial controllers of China, okay? And they're addicted to opium, okay? It's one of the main factors that brought war and eventually led to the Qing's downfall. Opium is going to ravish and destroy China, just like drugs could ravish and destroy your life. Okay, it can absolutely obliterate your life. It can obliterate entire societies and countries. And what we're going to see is this happening in China. I just pulled some quick data off the internet. You can go and Google this yourself. But when you Google it, you try to see like how many people die of drug overdose, like right now in 2020, right? I know it's just barely 2021, but we don't have data from 2021. But if you look at past data over the last few years, most of the data tells us that somewhere around 200 Americans die every day from drug overdose. And somewhere about 130 out of those 200 are from opioids. So if we learn a lesson from what's going to happen in China and see how this opium addiction is going to destroy the society of China, maybe we should look in a mirror and see how it's ravishing our own country and how drugs are devastating our own country. So some great statistics here that are showing the devastation that drugs can cause, and how this affects all of us. So here's a painting. The late 1800s, there's not a lot of photography. There is some. We have some actual pictures of people like Abraham Lincoln, who of course was president during the 1860s. So we do have some photography, but there's no action shots in the end of the 1800s. It was near the end of the 1800s where, laboratories like Thomas Edison's laboratory in the United States that was developing like moving photography or video, if you will. Not video per se, but old film strips. You have a picture on a clear sheet of plastic, and you have chemicals reacting to the light, and you shine light through it, and boom, you kind of get with old school flick movies, if you will. Film strips is another way to say it. So we're on the verge of getting moving pictures and on the verge of getting photography. But in the late 1800s, we still have to rely on people seeing things happen and then later on painting those to the best of their ability. And this is maybe a good shot of what it might have looked like during this catastrophic opium wars in China. So, what were the opium wars? Well, the military conflict between Great Britain and China in the 19th century over the opium trade is known as the Opium Wars. There's two opium wars, and there's fighting in between. But the first Opium War happens in the early 1800s, okay, before the Crimean War. Remember, the Crimean War is the 1850s. The American Civil War is the 1860s. So just kind of giving you a time frame reference. So the Second Opium War is right on the verge, right after the Second Opium War ends. The United States breaks out into the Civil War, ending slavery and that whole, trying to preserve the Union in our own country. So there's an epic civil war that's going to happen in the United States right after the Opium Wars, just to give you a time frame reference. Okay? China lost. China lost big time. They lost to European powers, mostly to the British, but you've got to remember that other merchants from other European countries, the Dutch were heavily involved in Asia, the French are heavily involved in Asia, the Portuguese still had some ports open, the Spanish are declining, but they still have some territories that they're going to lose to the United States. We'll talk about that later in the notes. But they lost to European powers and they were forced to sign treaties and give up territory to foreigners, where foreigners were exempt from Chinese law. They had this extraterritoriality to it. Why did China lose? The Industrial Revolution. You can mark that in your notes. What allows Europeans who have smaller populations and smaller countries to take over a giant behemoth of a country like China? It comes down to technology. And it comes down to society degrading from inside. And that a lot goes to that, drug use. Okay. So my answer is industrialism. Industrialism prevails. China's outdated ships were defeated by the modern British technology and weapons. The British had steam power. They had long range artillery. They had rapid firing, guns that the Chinese did not. The whole structure of government had been slowly consolidating in Great Britain over time to the point by the end of the 1800s, it's like a well-oiled machine. They can get things done quicker, faster than any other country. So speed is also involved, and that has to do with technology. They established something called the Treaty of Nanking. Now, there's lots of particulars that we could go into, but I think the Treaty of Nanking is one example of treaties that are unfair to China, and they put Europeans above the Chinese interests and helped Europeans establish treaty ports like Hong Kong. You probably all heard of Hong Kong. It's an island and a piece of a peninsula that the British owned for like 150 years. It was a piece of China that the British control. Right across the harbor is another one called Macau, but that was owned by the Portuguese. So it's really interesting. If you go to Hong Kong, there's tons of English spoken. There's lots of foreigners and foreign investment. And the people, kind of have a British sense where they drive on the left side of the road instead of the right, like they do on mainland China. And in recent years, the British had to return Hong Kong to China. And that's a big deal. There's a lot of people who wonder what's going to happen to Hong Kong because it's one of the most financially successful places in the world. It's got the British business idea like capitalism, but it's attached to the world's biggest marketplace. And so it's just like a hub. I remember teaching this class, like a year ago, 2 years ago, and Hong Kong just surpassed New York as the city with the most millionaires living in it. Hong Kong, it's a nice place, but it also can be devastatingly hard to live if you don't have a lot of money. It's very expensive in Hong Kong, and I mean very expensive. Property and territory in Hong Kong is outrageously expensive. Some of the most valuable, space, real estate on the planet Earth is in Hong Kong. So the areas where European countries controlled indirectly were known as spheres of influence. And I'm going to show you a map of these spheres of influence. I've got a great video here. I hope you take time to watch it about Hong Kong and Macau. But right here, you can see this map, and you can see where Europeans were taking control. Okay, so let's look at the key down here in the corner, and let's become better at reading maps and understanding information. And as we started the notes here today, that's got to be something that we remember. These colors don't mean anything unless we can compute the data. Okay, if you look at the dark green, that's where the British control, but so is the light green. So if you look on this key right here, the dark green is actual colonial possessions. The British consider that a part of their country. It's their colonial territory. All of India, which includes modern day Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, it's way more than just the country of India today. And also the country of Myanmar, sometimes still called Burma, and Malaysia down here as well. But the light green is place that everybody know the British control that too. They just don't directly control it. It's their sphere of influence. Nothing happens in that light green area without the British knowing what's going on and controlling that. Okay? The same thing would be true with the French. You can see what we call today Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. That's what they called French Indochina. And the area around Indochina was, dominated by the French, or within the French sphere of influence. Okay? Russia is also, heavily influential in northern China, Mongolia, and out in the nether regions of Central Asia, the steppe area, as we sometimes call it. There's several Stan countries out here, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and you even get the famous one, Afghanistan and Pakistan. You've heard of those ones before, but there's 7 Stan countries here, and Russia is having a huge influence on them, and it's encroaching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Okay? Here's what's really interesting. Germany is a brand new country, and it's trying to take a slice of the pie. Remember, Germany becomes a country at the end of the 1800s, 1870s, right? They're also trying to get their fingers into the pie. The United States is going to do the same thing, to be honest. It says right here on the map, in 1898, the United States is going to take the Philippines. So even the United States is going to put its finger in the Asian pie to try to get access to these Asian markets. So I don't want to say this the wrong way, but the United States doesn't care about the Philippines. What it cares about is access to China, the world's biggest marketplace. Okay, the one outlier here is Japan. We have talked about it briefly, and we're going to talk about it even more later. But Japan saw what was going on. They saw Europeans taking over all of Asia, and Japan essentially has to say this. They say, look, we either need to get on the ball, we either need to modernize, we need to industrialize, or Europeans are going to take us over like they have and are taking over everything else. So Japan is going to go through a rapid modernization process, the Meiji Restoration, and they're going to start taking over territories. They're going to play the same game. They're going to act like a European imperialistic power. They're going to seize Taiwan. They're going to have influence in the heart of China. They're going to take over the Korean Peninsula. And quite frankly, it's not too long after this that they're going to come into conflict with the United States in Pearl Harbor, and that's going to be World War II. But this is all starting in the late 1800s. It's not like the Japanese just woke up one day and said, hey, let's go bomb that U.S. military base in the middle of the Pacific for no reason. Of course there's a reason. And so that's what we're doing, is we're laying some of the groundwork here. So I really hope you take some time to really understand this map and see what you're looking at. The Japanese saw, or they see, the Japanese sees what Europeans are doing in China, and they decide to modernize and to industrialize so that the same thing doesn't happen to them. In fact, this is ironic. If you think that the Japanese maybe struck the first blow in Pearl Harbor and it was unprovoked, that's the way we learn about it in history class. But maybe this matters. In 1853, an American commander, a Commodore named Matthew Perry, led 4 ships into the harbor at Tokyo, okay, seeking to establish trade and discourse between Japan and the Western world. We went in with gunboats into Tokyo Harbor and said, you need to open up to trade or else. So the fact that the United States and Japan fight a war 100 years later, in the 1940s, maybe the seeds were being sown a century before when we showed up into Tokyo Bay with our gunships. Interesting, right? There's always more to the puzzle. There's always a process of chronological order to things happening. What I'd like to do right now is to tell you about the biggest civil war that you've never heard of. I'm going to talk to you right now about a civil war that is 20 times bigger than the American Civil War. I'm going to talk to you about the brother of Jesus. Yeah, you heard me right. I'm going to talk about the brother of Jesus who started this war. Now I'm going to put a little disclaimer in here. I honestly don't think he was the brother of Jesus. He was a messed up person, but he claimed that he was the brother of Jesus. Now, if I haven't got your attention, we're going to talk about one of the biggest wars in the history of the world. A war that kills millions of people. A war that in sheer number of deaths could go up there in the top 5, easily top 10 biggest wars in human history. The Taiping Rebellion. It is a massive civil war in China from 1850 to 1864. Ironically, about the same time as the American Civil War. Which one is bigger and causes more death and destruction? The U.S. Civil War or the Taiping Rebellion? It's not even close by the time we're done talking about it. Because the Chinese lost the first Opium War, the government of China loses credibility. The giant, huge, behemoth government of China, population-wise, even the biggest back in the 1800s, it lost to tiny little Great Britain. And so the Chinese lost their credibility. And this leads to one of the worst military conflicts in history. The leader of the rebellion against the Qing dynasty was a guy named Hong Shikong. And he believed he was the brother of Jesus. Now, this is interesting because you have to know a little bit about China. China is not traditionally Christian. So how could this random dude in the middle of China start thinking that he's the brother of Jesus when Christianity isn't even like a significant religion in China per se? How does Christianity get into China? Europeans bring it, right? When Europeans set up trading posts, some people are there just to make money, but some people come to convert people to Christianity. Traditionally, China is Confucianist. Confucianism is kind of a religion. It's more of a philosophy, but there is spirituality and rituals to go along with it. So some people would consider it a religion. There was a dude named Confucius who helped kind of codify Chinese culture and set up a system of loyalty and honor and tradition, kind of tapped into ancestor worship, if you will, as well. And, most people have, opened an American fortune cookie, have read something from Confucius that wasn't written by Confucius, but you kind of heard that name before, I'm quite sure. Chinese society is very rooted in Confucian ideology, okay, and putting the proper order to things, respecting your elders and who serves who, and basing things off of merit and not just the family you were born into. Another religious idea from Lao Tzu that had a huge influence in Chinese culture is called Taoism, the way. Sometimes it's spelled with a T and sometimes with a D because we're just trying to reconstruct a Chinese idea with an English letters, or Latin letters in English language. But Taoism, if you've seen the yin yang, the white and the black kind of swirled together, the light and dark, and good and evil, that's very much a Taoist idea. Of course, later on, Buddhism has its influence in China, and there are different forms of Buddhism. One goes south into Southeast Asia, and then one goes north across the continent into Korea and even to Japan. There's two main branches in Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, those are really the dominant religions and cultural ideas of China. And so to have this guy, Hong Shikuang, thinking that he's the brother of Jesus, how does all that mix in? The story, and I'm not going to go into this story all the way. You can go Google it if you want. It's a great story. But this guy, Hong Shikuang, he got sick and he started to have a fever. And as he was kind of hallucinating and maybe, smoking opium too, that's one of the theories here. Maybe he's getting high, and the fact that maybe he's getting sick, but he has some hallucinations. At the same time, he got a hold of some Christian literature, like some tracts that had been written by Christian missionaries. And so if you can combine maybe this drug hallucination problem and maybe just some sickness and having these visions, he starts to tell people that he's the brother of Jesus, and he's calling upon them. Hong tells the people to fight against the Qing government. So Hong fought, and his followers, people started rallying around him, believing that he was a prophet, if you will, or the brother of Jesus, okay? And he says we need to fight against the Qing government because they're losers and they're allowing problems to come into our country, and they lost to the British, so they're not respectable anymore. And it's about the same time as the Second Opium War. And Hong tries to establish what he called the heavenly kingdom. In truth, it's going to be a living hell. It is estimated that over 20 million people died in this civil war, including related deaths to famine and disease. It wasn't all, deaths in battle. But when people are dying and society is being uprooted, then food production goes down and disease starts to spread. And it's estimated that some 20 million people died. That's a number as big as World War I. I've seen even bigger numbers, by the way. I've read stuff online and different articles that say maybe up to 40 million people died in China during the Taiping Rebellion. The worst war in American history, when Americans were killing Americans, is the Civil War. And the number that historians throw out for the Civil War is 600,000. That's just over 500,000. And I just told you that the Taiping Rebellion, some 20 million people died. So it's catastrophically huge. Some people who study modern day China will point out that the modern government of China is a communist government, and it pushes atheism, atheistic ideology. So China, the government of China, won't allow official religion in their country. Even for Americans, like if my sister went over to China and worked in China teaching English, and she wanted to go to a church, a Christian-based church, and she had to travel like 2 hours on train to find a group of American Christians who were meeting just so she could go to church, because they wouldn't officially allow churches in China because it's very atheist, no religion. And some people are like, why? Why does the communist government hate religion so much? Well, if you look at what Europeans do to China during the 1800s and how bad it's going to get in China during the 20th century, during the 1900s, you might understand why why the government of China is atheistic It's got some serious issues. People have a bad taste in their mouth for all the death and destruction that happened when European colonials came in and really took advantage of China at a weak point at the end of the Qing dynasty. Here's another example. It's not as big as the Taiping Rebellion, not even close to as big as the Taiping Rebellion, but the United States of America got involved in the Boxer Rebellion. So the United States wanted to get access to China as well. The problem is we don't have anything close to Asia. The entire Pacific Ocean cuts us off from Asia. If you want to trade with Asia, you've got to find places to refuel and places to set up, naval bases in the Pacific. So we took over the country that was sometimes called the Sandwich Islands. Today, we call that Hawaii. So we took over Hawaii. We took over places like American Samoa. When I was a kid, I was a little kid. We lived in American Samoa. My little brother was born in American Samoa. Check that out on Google Maps. It's like halfway in between Hawaii and New Zealand, or halfway in between Hawaii and the Philippines. But in the end of the 1800s, 1898, the United States fought a war with Spain. Back in the 14 and 1500s, Spain was legit. Even in the 1600s, Spain is pretty legit. By the time we started getting into like the 1700s, by the end of the 1700s and into the early 1800s, Spain is on the decline. Napoleon takes over Spain and puts his brother on the throne. And in the disarray of all that, in the early 1800s, most of the countries in North and South America that were controlled by Spain break away and gain their independence. So by the end of the 1800s, Spain is a shell of what it used to be. It's got almost nothing left, and the United States swoops in and takes over the rest in a very one-sided war. The United States just kicks trash, okay? We weren't so much interested in the Spanish territories as we were getting access to Asian markets, okay? The Boxers were Chinese people that wanted to rid China of foreigners and push imperialism out of China. So they called themselves the Boxers. Many European nations, and I'm including the US, and you might say, Mr. Moore, the United States is not a European country, but we are. All of the people who have been president of the United States have been of European descent. Even Barack Obama, who was our first black president, is half black. His dad was from Africa, but his mom was white. So the United States is a very European country. We speak English. We follow, European law, common law. The roots of our civilization are traced back to Europe. Okay. So many European nations, including the US, attacked Beijing. People used to call, that's the capital of China, Beijing. People used to call it Peking. Not so much a name change as it is the way we say Chinese words with English sounds. But they attacked Beijing or Peking to maintain their trade empires. The United States sent troops into Peking to try to secure trade access to China. European powers, along with the US, defeated the Boxers and added to their spheres of influence in China. It's kind of like putting a nail in the coffin of the Qing Empire. It's like the final straw after the catastrophic Taiping Rebellion, which was finally suppressed. And then you get things like the Boxer Rebellion, which are small in comparison as far as number of deaths, but now you're just getting more foreign control of China. It's not small, it's just smaller than the Taiping Rebellion. Over 100,000 people were killed in the fighting. Most of them were civilians. So it's not small, but it's ridiculously small compared to the Taiping Rebellion. Over the next century, the 1900s, China's going to go through major turmoil. China is rocked during World War II. China's going to be rocked with a communist revolution. China's going to go through a cultural revolution that's going to kill millions and millions and millions of people. And in some ways, it's going to make the Taiping Rebellion look small. What's going to go on in China from, say, like the 1860s to the 1960s is so catastrophic it's hard for us to understand, especially since we don't study that much in school. We focus on our own country and our own issues and our own wars, which are significant to us, but sometimes we miss the bigger picture of what matters in the world. Right now, China is just beginning to come to its full potential. Today, 2021, China is the second biggest economy in the world. They're going to be number one. And I think they should be number one, just sheer number of people. Whether you agree with their politics or not, China has most human beings, right? So they should have the biggest slice of the economic pie. Okay? Just some thoughts, food for thought. This is a painting of American troops going into Peking or Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. Hundreds of thousands, 100,000 people died, so it's not small, but it's nothing compared to the Taiping Rebellion. These images show the Chinese trying to drive out foreigners during the Boxer Rebellion. I mean, here's the United States coming in with its liberty, its freedom, its democracy. Is it, or is it just trying to expand trade? And I don't know if you're looking at this picture right here, but these are heads, European heads on pikes, Christian missionaries being killed, burnt. The Chinese were trying to drive foreigners out of their country. So, Western powers ruled all of Asia by the end of the 19th century. By the end of the 1800s, the British controlled all of India, which at the time included places like Pakistan and Bangladesh. The British separately controlled places like Myanmar or Burma, along with other places like Malaysia or Singapore. You've heard of Singapore, one of the richest places in the world today, kind of like Hong Kong, a little port city that was controlled by the British and controlled all trade in the area. The British also tried to take Afghanistan, but they failed. The British tried to take Afghanistan and failed. Then the Russians in the 1900s or 20th century also tried to control Afghanistan and failed. The last people to invade Afghanistan, the United States of America, trying to track down a terrorist named Osama bin Laden. And that's been within the last 20 years. We've been involved in Afghanistan for close to 20 years now. And I know we've pulled tons of troops out, but we're still heavily involved. Afghanistan is just a hard place to rule. Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia were called Indochina. Thailand, back then it was called Siam, kind of sort of maintained its independence. It kind of served as a buffer between the British and the French. So some people say Thailand is one country that didn't succumb to imperialism, but that's only kind of a sort of thing. The Netherlands or the Dutch controlled Indonesia. And of course, the US took Guam and the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. We also took the Pacific Islands of Hawaii and Samoa, but those were separate events. So we took the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, and it was separate encounters where we took over Samoa and, part of Samoa. We split it with the Germans, to be honest. There's two Samoas today. There's one that's still a territory of the U.S., American Samoa, that's where I lived, Pango Pango Tutuila. Or there's the other half called Western Samoa that was controlled by the Germans for a long time, because they were also trying to get overseas territories, okay? Here's one map of imperialism in Asia. You can see where the British are controlling, okay? You can see where the French are controlling, where the Dutch are controlling, where the Americans come in and control. The Spanish were controlling it. The United States comes in. And even Japan, who was threatened by Europeans, started to act in the same manner. And of course, Russia is just catastrophically big, even to this very day. So, just a heads up, the United States was also involved in this imperialism game. We kind of functioned under what we called the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe is the fifth president of the United States. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the second James in a row is James Monroe. So the Monroe Doctrine was kind of a doctrine that said, basically, we wanted Europeans to stay out of North and South America, meaning North and South America are our playground. That's our territory. So don't get involved. And if you do get involved, you're going to deal with the United States. So that's a U.S. government policy that declared Latin America off limits to European colonial powers. That's not because we were being nice. That's because we wanted access to those raw materials for our own industrial benefit and to help our economy. Okay? From 1868 to 1878, Cubans fought against Spanish imperialism. The U.S. had a lot of investments in Cuba, and that's really what ignites the Spanish-American War. So just off the coast of Florida, there's some insurrection and fighting, and in 1898, the U.S. sent a battleship, okay, and it sends it into the harbor in Havana. That's the capital of Cuba. And then the ship explodes, the USS Maine. It explodes. And of course, everybody blames Spanish terrorists. Was it really Spanish terrorists? I don't know. There's a lot of controversy over what really happened to that ship. But of course, we blamed the Spanish. They had back then in the 1800s what they called yellow journalism. They also sometimes called the reporters muck rakers, whereas they're trying to just dig up dirt. Sometimes news agencies are like that. They're just trying to find the dirt. And so starts the Spanish-American War. The U.S. easily wins the war against Spain. Cuba becomes a U.S. protectorate. It's kind of like our territory to do what we want, acting as a quasi-independent country. The United States also acquired Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory. We acquired Guam in the middle of the Pacific, which is still a U.S. territory. And this is random, but we also acquired the Philippines. At the same time, we sent troops into Cuba, Spanish territory. We sent the U.S. Navy into the Philippines, which was a Spanish territory. And we rocked the Spanish Navy. Very one-sided battles. And in many ways, the entire story of the U.S. and the history of our country, spreading from sea to shining sea via this manifest destiny, is a story of imperialism. If you ask Native Americans, we took over their territory, claimed it as our own, pushed our politics and our religion and our culture and our language on them. So the United States was also very much involved in imperialism. Okay? Again, I think I've gone over the Spanish-American War enough that you understand we fought a war with Spain. Very one-sided. It was sometimes called a splendid little war because there was very little death on the U.S. side. We rocked Spain, and we kind of come out of the war thinking we're all that and more. We also annexed Hawaii in a separate move. We kicked the Queen of Hawaii out of her throne and took over the islands at almost the same time. And then right after, of course, we acquired American Samoa. Nice little video about U.S. imperialism. After we had won the Spanish-American War, the President of the United States sent a fleet around the globe to show off U.S. military power. It cost a lot of money to send a giant a fleet of ships around the globe. It's called the Great White Fleet. And the United States sailed it in the early 1900s to just show off military power. Imagine parking tons of giant warships, state-of-the-art, really nicely built ones, and we just took it around the entire globe to kind of show off. Okay. The President of the United States during a lot of this is first it's William McKinley. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he actually was not the president at the time. He actually was kind of like starting his own little military group, the Rough Riders, and kind of volunteers to go kick butt in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And then shortly thereafter becomes vice president. And when William McKinley is shot and killed, in Buffalo, New York, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. And he kind of says, you speak softly and carry a big stick. And that's what you need to do to control the Americas. And the United States just starts to play the same game. One of the key things we did was to help fund the Panama Canal. The French and the British started building the Suez Canal back in 1869. Remember, the Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean. Let me just come back here 1 second. This is the Suez Canal. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, which means you don't have to go around Africa to get to Asian markets. The Panama Canal, of course, is going to cut in the middle of the Americas because otherwise you have to go all the way around South America if you want to take shipping goods from New York to Los Angeles or San Francisco, right? So the Panama Canal is very much like the Suez Canal. It was built for economic reasons. And in 1903, the U.S. helped Panama win independence from Colombia. For 10 years, Americans and hired hands built the canal to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Building the Panama Canal was an engineering challenge, and hundreds, thousands of people died of malaria. The Panama Canal helped the U.S. become a world power. And when the Great White Fleet sails around the world, they didn't go through the Panama Canal, but you can see it's happening at the same time. So the Panama Canal and this Great White Fleet showing it off. By 1914, the Great White Fleet is done, but the Panama Canal opens, and then ships can cut off so much trade, so much time when it comes to trade. 2 years before 9/11, this is not ancient history, guys. 2 years before 9/11, the U.S. returned the canal to Panama. So it's just over 20 years ago, 20 years ago, that the United States returned the Panama Canal to Panama. It was like our territory. We built it, we got it, we used it, we just barely returned it to Panama. And of course, this is just kind of showing you how much trade goes through the Panama Canal and why it's so significant. It's like 51 miles. It takes about 1 day. That's way better than a month or whatever going around South America. It's a whole system of canals and locks, because if this is sea level, the actual land is higher than sea level. So when a ship goes in, they have to close locks and then fill it with water, so you raise the ship up, and it's quite significant to get through. It's an amazing marvel of engineering. Gigantic, huge locks that will close behind ships and then raise those ships up. This is actually a photo of President Roosevelt, who went down to personally inspect, the Panama Canal being built. So this is kind of what it looks like from above. A ship goes in, they pump water into it to raise it up, and then they go to the next lock and then raise it up, and then they can go through the wetlands in Panama. It's a major feat of engineering. The last thing I'm going to talk about is U.S. intervention in Mexico. There's a sort of civil war that breaks out right next to the United States. Some people call it a revolution, the Mexican Revolution, but it's a sort of civil war. After independence from Spain in the early 1800s, remember like 1810, right, where Mexico claims independence from Spain. In the meantime, the United States takes a giant chunk off of Mexico, right? We talked about that, the Mexican-American War. And then the French invade under Napoleon III. Not like he was actually there, but his troops go in. And so by the end of the 1800s, Mexico's trying to solidify its own borders, and it's very vulnerable and politically unstable. And so revolutionary leaders often abuse their powers to get rich. So these governments lack legitimacy with the common people. Most citizens living in Mexico in the 1800s were illiterate and had limited opportunities. The United States began to aggressively control parts of North and South America economically and politically. That's imperialism, right? There was even some U.S. filibusters. I was in Nicaragua. I went into a museum in a city called Granada, Nicaragua. And I guess I'd never heard this story before, but it was talking about this American guy who started a business, and then he hired people who were trained in the military, And then he basically formed his own private military and went down to Nicaragua and took over, like made his own country in Central America. He was an American citizen who literally hired his own army and went down and formed his own country where present day Nicaragua is. And he called himself a filibuster, like his own private little military operation. So that wasn't like necessarily sanctioned by the US government, but it was an American citizen. So political, social, and economic problems, as well as inequality, brought about a period of revolution and reform in Mexico in 1910, about 100 years after Mexican independence. Leaders arose controlling different areas in Mexico. Madero is one of the famous leaders of the Mexican Revolution. But one of the most famous revolutionaries is Pancho Villa. I don't know if you've ever heard about Pancho Villa, but some people think he was a hero. Some people think he's a villain. But he would raid towns in the US to get supplies and then go back across the Mexican border to help fund his fighting in Mexico. And every time he crossed the border into the United States and caused problems or US citizens died, the US government started to pay attention to that. And so the US started to send troops into Mexico multiple times in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So here's just a recap. There was a plain, a regular American citizen who basically took over Nicaragua during the 1800s. That wasn't sanctioned by the government. That was like his own personal expedition. Tons of Americans moved into this part of Mexico, so many, in fact, that they broke away in the Texas Revolution and formed their own country, the Republic of Texas. Later, 10 years later, the Republic of Texas joins the United States as a state. That provokes a greater war with Mexico, in which all the territory that we now think of as California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and of course all of Texas become a part of the United States. But we took that from Mexico in the 1800s. So there's some serious issues going on as the United States expands. So if you want to learn more about China, okay, Buddhism, and China in general, or about imperialism in China, and I think that's one of the key ones you should really pay attention to, right? Migration that's happening out of Europe into the United States, or if you want to look at say the Second Industrial Revolution, there's tons of great videos that I've tried to collect off of YouTube to help you understand this concept. Thank you for being with me. This is week 21 on social unrest in the world during the late 19th century. We'll talk to you next week.